Hello and welcome to Ratio Christi Television. Today we're talking about slavery, which still happens throughout the world today. But of course, it does have a long history, so it's a blessing to have our guest with me today. Ratio Christi is a campus apologetics alliance. We set up Christian apologetics clubs on university, college, community college, and high school campuses throughout the United States and internationally as well. However, we're not just reaching students, we're actually reaching Christian professors, professors who are confessors, Christian professors who on your child or grandchild's very own school campus can then impact that school campus, impact that classroom, and impact their life throughout their entire career. We say that when we get a student, we get them for 4 years. When we get a professor, we get the classroom for 30 years. Just go to ratiochristi.org, go up to the top, click on RC Prof to learn more about that. The purpose of Ratio Christi is to make people aware of the evidence for the Christian worldview and to point people to truth with a capital T, which is why we call our program Truth Matters. Joining me is Bill Federer. He is a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and president of Amerisearch Incorporated, a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. Bill's American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America and by the internet. His Faith and History television airs on the TCT network on stations across America and via DirecTV. He has appeared on many television and radio programs, has been quoted in many publications, and has authored many books, including a couple which will give you a lot more information about today's topic than we're able to give you in a 28-minute episode. Those two books that you should pick up are Change to Chains, The 6,000-Year Quest for Control, and What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam and the United States. He has been here a couple of times before, and it's always a blessing to have him here. Bill Federer, welcome back to Ratio Christi's Truth Matters. I cannot hear any audio from you, so hopefully we can get that fixed here rather quickly. Friends, I want you to check out Bill's website as well. It is AmericanMinutes.com. And you'll find a lot of different information there, not historical information, but if you also sign up for his newsletter, he sends those out daily, if not a couple times a day, and he gives you a lot of history and basically tidbits of what you will get on his AmericanMinute.com website and his Amerisearch organization, which gives people the history of America. You'll get little snippets of that in the daily emails that he sends out. He has pictures included in there, a lot of historical information, sometimes information that you don't get in the public school system. But Bill isn't worried about being politically correct and sugarcoating stuff. He just tells you like it is and tells you how it was. So, Bill, do we have your audio working now?
I hope so. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. You sound fine. Thank you for being on again.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you for having me.
This is a ongoing, timely topic, more so than people realize, because many times when they hear the term slavery, they think back to, African Americans enslaved by white Europeans, and that's it. They don't have all the details. They don't know slavery that happened before that, after that, that's still happening today, in the different flavors of slavery that are happening and have happened. How far back in history did slavery actually begin?
Well, with the beginning of record keeping, we have Hammurabi's Code around 2000 BC, and it's a hierarchical structure with the king Hammurabi at the top, and then the elite class, and then the merchant class, and the scribes and the soldiers, and then the slaves on the bottom. And of course, there was slavery in Egypt. But slavery exists wherever there's a hierarchical pyramid structure to society, where you have the king and the pharaoh at the top, and those that serve him, and then the military, and then the peasants, and then underneath the slaves. You had, obviously, the Jews were in slavery in Egypt, and the worth of a person was how well they could benefit the guy on the top of the pyramid. And ancient Israel, believe it or not, is the first instance in history where we have a nation ruled without a king, and they introduced a form of government where everyone was equal before the law. And this was a brand new concept. But We've had slavery in the Roman era, and St. Patrick was captured from Britain and taken as a slave to Druid Ireland. And he escaped and then came back to Ireland when he was around 40 years old as a missionary. And then when the British began to capture some of the people he brought to Christ and make them slaves, he wrote a letter to Coroticus, the Briton king, and really slammed into him and said, "You're taking the bride of Christ and making her a harlot, selling her into a brothel," right? Because these are people that Patrick had brought to Christ, and now they're being kidnapped and enslaved. And so he's considered one of the first abolitionists. And then we had the Muslim slavery, and Muhammad himself owned slaves. And the example and the teachings of Muhammad were you would offer a community a voluntary choice to submit, and if they didn't, you would wage war, and you would kill some people, but what do you do with the ones who surrender? Well, you keep some, but then you sell the rest of them into slavery. And so the Muslims had slave ports and all around Africa. And if you'd like, I can get into that a little bit more. But long and short of it, slavery's been around from the beginning of time. Now we have it in communist countries. And the people, it's a pyramid structure to that society. So every communist country has a dictator: Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro. Hitler was the head of the National Socialist Workers' Party. Stalin was actually the head of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And so socialism, communism is basically a dictatorship. People say, well, I thought that's where everyone owns everything equally. Well, you have to think a little deeper. Who decides who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house? Oh, somebody in the government dictates those things. Well, whoever dictates those things is the dictator. We have sex trafficking and forced marriages in Muslim countries, and that's the equivalent of slavery. And actually, the statistics show there's more slavery today than at any other time in world history. And a whole lot of it is in India with generational indebtedness. So a great-grandfather got in debt, and nobody can pay it off, and it gets compounded, and then all the kids and grandkids are born into this servitude, this debt that they'll never get out of. And then the Muslims countries have slavery. Mauritania, Niger, Sudan, where they still enslave people today. So it's an issue that we need to be educated on, and it goes back to the beginning of recorded history. The Judeo-Christian influence, whenever it has been in a country, has gradually eliminated slavery. And then, of course, in America, there was an abolitionist movement that ended slavery.
And where did the word slave originate?
Well, Julius Caesar, the Romans conquered into Gaul, which is France, and then they conquered into Eastern Europe, and they captured Slavic people. And the word Slav meant glorious one. It was the name of a people group. We get Yugoslav, Slovenia, Czechoslovakia, and the Romans captured so many of these Slavs and sold them in Rome as permanent servants that the word Slav got the connotation of the pronunciation slave. And so that's where it came from. It was we use the Latin Roman word of a permanent servant as a Slav.
And I just want to let our folks know, I let them know that you have a great website where they can sign up to get your daily emails. If you love Bill's information, which again, you don't get in your public school books, he'll give you a little snippet of these historical nuggets every single day in the email. You can sign up for that. Bill, how did the Muslims get involved in the slave trade?
Well, as I mentioned, Muhammad owned slaves. He owned African slaves like Bilal. And then the Muslims enslaved the tribal Africans and would kill about a third in the conquest. And then the elderly and young would not survive the forced marches to the slave markets. And they would march them across the Sahara Desert where they would die. They would march them to Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, the Niger River, and sell them into slavery. Khartoum in Sudan was a big Muslim slave trading city. And Tanzania, the Zanzibar coast, was a big slave trading coast. So the Muslims had slavery of Africans for 8 centuries before America was ever discovered. Now, when the Muslims conquered Constantinople, it cut off the land routes to India, and that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. And Spain claimed all the New World, and they enslaved the Native Americans for about 50 years. And then there was a Catholic priest named Bartolome de las Casas. And he spent his whole life trying to get the King of Spain to outlaw the enslavement of Native Americans. When he was finally successful in getting slavery of Native Americans outlawed, the greedy people said, where can we get more slaves? And someone said, Africa. And so that's when the Spanish and the Portuguese and later the Dutch would go to the Muslim slave markets and purchase Africans and bring them to the New World. But literally, every African brought to the New World as a slave was purchased at Muslim slave markets. That's one of those chapters that sort of conveniently gets overlooked. Now, in Europe, interesting, you had the Roman Empire was going bankrupt, and people were just abandoning their farms because they couldn't pay the debt, and they would just leave and live with the barbarians. And Diocletian instituted a new law that you could not leave your land if there was a debt on it. And so this tied people to the land, and this grew into the feudal system in Europe, which lasted for 1,000 years. And so you would have a feudal lord that was responsible to collect taxes for the king, and then you had the feudal peasants that are tied to the land and their type of slavery. In America, pre-Columbus, you had a type of slavery where the Aztecs would capture peoples and enslave them, and then, of course, use some of them for human sacrifice. The same thing happened in Peru. So there was slavery in America pre-Christopher Columbus coming over. And we could talk about Asia and the other countries. But wherever there's a hierarchical system where you have a king, there's people that are going to be at the bottom. Now, in another one of my books, I talk about how the colonial America, you came up with a congregational form of church government, and they applied that to politics and called it a congregational form of community government. And it was a bottom-up form of government that eventually turned into our U.S. Constitution.
And this is information that, again, people will not get in their public school books. Bill's information is information you definitely want to supplement, if nothing else, with the information that your kids and grandkids get from school. So again, sign up for his daily newsletter. Also, get the 2 books that we showed on the screen on Islam and on just the history of this in general. And also, get this information and share with other people as well, because a lot of people are not aware of this. Again, Bill tells it like it is. He gives you the actual historical information here. Bill, you talked about Native Americans and Muslims enslaving them, but did Muslims ever enslave Europeans?
Yeah, this is a missed chapter. So Muhammad got a whole chapter of the Quran on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's Surah 8, chapter 8. He gets 1/5 of the booty. And Allah told Muhammad that the slave girls were given to him as booty. Well, as the Muslims began to go onto the Mediterranean Sea, they had ships and they would attack the coast of Italy. There were whole coasts of Italy where there was not a woman of childbearing age for generations because the Muslim pirates would come up and capture them and sell them into the harems in North Africa. In 846 AD, 11,000 Muslims invaded Rome, and they trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. It was after that that Pope Leo decided to build a 39-foot wall around the Vatican, right? So we have the Pope building a wall to keep the Muslims out anyway. And so they would enslave and capture Europeans. So there were whole Catholic orders throughout the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians, and the head of the order was called the ransomer. And they would collect alms and donations and go under a white flag to meet the Muslims in North Africa to try to ransom your friend back, who was captured from a Greek island or an Italian coast. And then they went into the Atlantic, and the Muslim pirates attacked England. And in 1625, they carried away over 1,000 from England into Moroccan slavery. The Pilgrims had saved up 800 pounds of beaver skins, and in 1625, they sent the boat back to England. William Bradford writes that it was in the English Channel when a Turkish man of war captured it, took it to Morocco, and sold the crew into slavery. Then they attacked Ireland and the stolen village of Baltimore, Ireland. The Muslims come up, kill a bunch, round up the whole town, put them on ships, take them to Morocco, sell them into slavery. And even Iceland, around 1640, they captured 400 from Reykjavik, Iceland, took them to Morocco, sold them into slavery. And one was the daughter of an important person, and the King of Denmark sent a fleet down there to ransom her back. The Sultan in Morocco was Moulay Ismail, and he had an estimated 500 wives and over 1,000 children, and but he had 25,000 European slaves. That's right, you had a Muslim in Morocco that owned 25,000 European slaves. He had African slaves too, and the reports are that if he came out on a certain day dressed in yellow, that meant that somebody was going to die that day, and he would go out and hunt his own African servants. And someone gave him a little hatchet that was captured from a Portuguese ship, and he tries it out on one of his African slaves just to see how it worked. Right, killed him, hacked him to death. And so he'd bring a change of clothes with him whenever we'd go out so he could take off the bloody ones. And so the Islamic slavery of Europeans was a real thing, and it went on for centuries. And matter of fact, that was one of the stories in Holland where they would tell the kids that St. Nicholas comes once a year to give a present. But if you're naughty, he has a little helper, Zwarte Piet, Black Peter, who's a Moor, a Muslim, and he'll put you in a gunny sack, take you back to Spain, and sell you into Muslim slavery. And so, unfortunately, this was a significant chapter in European history. And it's sort of amazing how our heritage is so short. A friend of mine is Armenian, and Cynthia Gashgorian, and she told about how her grandfather was a slave, captured during the Armenian massacre, sold 5 times, and then he was in Tunisia, and how he was putting bags of grain on a ship, and he hid amongst the bags of grain, and the ship landed in France, and he escaped and eventually came to America. So we have to understand that this is something that's gone on for centuries. But again, the Judeo-Christian belief system has been the most powerful force in freeing slaves.
And it's very important, too, for people to look at the actual life and teachings of Jesus Christ and the actual life and teachings of Muhammad, because they are the measuring rods for someone who calls themselves a Christian or someone who calls themselves a Muslim. You know, people see like ISIS and they're like, oh yeah, they're not Islamic because they have a slave trade and all this other stuff. Well, if you study the life of Muhammad and that lines right up with them, well, then it's pretty ridiculous to say, well, they're not Islamic because they're doing this or that, if that's exactly what Muhammad did himself. And talking about this history of slavery from many centuries ago up to today, we see all these different ways in which that has come about. Who brought African slaves to the New World?
Well, it was the Spanish and the Portuguese and then the Dutch. The first slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. It was a Dutch ship, and it was blown off course, and they were starving, and they didn't have any money for food, so they traded a couple African slaves for some food. So those were the very first slaves. The year was 1619, and that was in Virginia. And unfortunately, that whet the appetite, and so the European slave trade began. There was also something called indentured servants, where you would have poor Europeans. They wanted to come to the New World. They had no money, but they would sell themselves into slavery for a 7-year period. Afterwards, they would be given their freedom. But so that was a type of slavery. Then you had another chapter. You had Catholic Spain, Catholic Ireland, and originally it was Catholic England, but Henry VIII split away. Then you had Queen Elizabeth, and the Spaniards and the Irish had teamed up, and they had planned to try to recapture England. Well, England decided no, and they marched into Ireland, and Spain left. The battle was Kinsdale, something like that. And the British captured and sold into slavery about 500,000 Irish, and sold them throughout the Caribbean, sold them into the colonies in America. And so in the 1600s, more Irish were sold into slavery than Africans. The African slave trade really didn't pick up until the 17 and 1800s.
Now, as we work on this historical timeline, moving closer to where we are today, which political party in America defended slavery and which party fought against it?
Well, obviously, the Democrat Party was pro-slavery, and there were the Whigs, which were the party that was sort of the big tent party. They eventually dissolved, and out of it was birthed the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, and the original Republican Party platform had 2 planks: eliminate polygamy in the territories of Utah and eliminate slavery. And so, but you had the Deep South passing laws making it a crime to teach slaves to read, Of course, they could not own a weapon, and they percentage-wise, there was not that many slaveholders that were large numbered. The big plantations did. A fair amount of people may have had one or two slaves. Unfortunately, the North was involved in the slave trade, but the slave trade was actually outlawed in 1807 by the U.S. Constitution. But it didn't free the slaves within the country, and that didn't happen until after the Civil War. And that was a result of the Second Great Awakening. In England, you had William Wilberforce and John Newton, the person who was a slave trader that became a Christian, and then he became an Anglican minister, and then he began to preach against the slave trade. Of course, he wrote his famous song, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found." So that's a powerful song. But England had outlawed slavery before America, but then we did have a civil war and ended it. But Cuba continued slavery all the way up until the Spanish-American War in 1898, and slavery was finally ended in Cuba.
Now, you've mentioned how Christians and the Christian worldview transforming a person's mind is what has been the seed to then going and helping to abolish slavery. Speaking of church history, what role did the Second Great Awakening play in the abolitionist movement?
Right. So the First Great Awakening took place in the 1750s and 60s and sort of spread through the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. After the Revolution, you had the Second Great Awakening revival, and it spread all throughout. You had camp meetings in the Kentucky woods where 25,000 people would show up. They didn't have microphones, and so they'd have like a dozen different platforms, and all the preachers would be preaching at the same time. And then in the universities, you had Timothy Dwight, and they would preach to these college students, and a revival started amongst Yale and the different universities. Well, they began to do several things. Some missionaries all around the world. They started abolitionist societies and temperance societies to get rid of drinking, the American Bible Society, American Tract Society. A lot of new denominations were started, a lot of hospitals and different things. But this abolitionist movement to free the slaves. So you basically had the country divided in five. You had the extreme Republican North that wanted to free the slaves now. You had the moderate Republican North that said we got to transition out of it over time. You had the neutral that could care less about social issues. They just cared about taxes and tariffs and so forth. You had the moderate Democrat South that said slavery's wrong, but we got to live with it. It's been there for centuries. Just treat your slave really nice. And then the extreme Democrat South that said slavery's good. Let's expand it into the new territories coming into the Union, and let's make the North participate in slavery with the fugitive slave law. So if a slave escapes, they have to turn that slave in, and if they don't, they're guilty of a federal crime. And so you had the country divided in these five categories. I sort of think that's similar to today, where you have the Republicans that want to end slavery now, end abortion now, and then the moderate rhinos that say, well, let's transition, take our time. Those that don't care about the abortion issue. The moderate Democrats that say, well, abortion, let's have it be rare and few. And then the extreme Democrats, like the former president, when he was a senator in Illinois, actually voted that if a baby survived an abortion attempt, that the baby should be left in a hospital closet to die. And when he was president, he wanted to force people like little nuns who are against abortion to have to pay for it, to participate in it. Anyway, so those five divisions are sort of the same that we have today.
All this history, and we only have a couple minutes left, I want to ask you, is slavery still taking place in the world today? And if so, in what forms?
Well, the sex trafficking, and unfortunately, it's been growing with the lack of morals. There's more and more people involved in it. The Islamic slave trade that goes on in Niger, Mauritania, Sudan, different countries, and under different names, like forced marriages and the sex trafficking and things like that. And then, of course, in India, as I mentioned, indentured servants and in generational indebtedness. And then in communist countries, North Korea, If you don't believe the way the Kim Jong-un is, and if you're a Christian, you're tortured in a labor camp the rest of your life, and you're treated as property. So it goes on today. And again, the teachings of Jesus, where he says all men are created in the image of God, and he reiterates what's been written in Genesis. Jesus says, he that made them male and female, and said the man shall leave the father and cleave to his wife, the two shall become one. Jesus confirmed the teachings of the Old Testament when it came to the value of human life. And even the, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In other words, Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you don't want to be a slave, then don't enslave anybody else. That's the big teaching. And he said, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you've done unto me. And so if you're enslaving somebody, you're treating Jesus that way. So the Christian teaching is the software program to help counteract the selfishness that likes to use people. And Lord willing, we'll see the slavery end and everyone be treated equally.
Amen. Bill, every time you come here, you bring a whole lot of info for our viewers to think about. So I want to thank you so much for being here once again on Ratio Christi's Truth Matters.
Thank you, Tony.
Friends, check out Bill's books. Again, the two books that we were showing you in this particular episode, Change to Chains, the 6,000-year quest for control, and what every American needs to know about the Quran, a history of Islam and the United States. A whole lot of info in those two books, way more than we can give you in this particular episode. Again, this is just whetting your appetite for the information that Bill is continually spreading every single day. Again, go to his website and also sign up for his daily newsletter. It's pretty short. It's not really long, and it gives you pictures. It gives you historical facts. Again, great information to supplement your public school curriculum, or anyone who just wants to know about history. It has been said, those who don't study history are destined to repeat it. Unfortunately, we're seeing today, those who do study history are forced to watch other people repeat it, and we don't want that to see that happen either. So the gospel, as usual, is the solution to all of this. When somebody repents, they put their trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, they are born again. As Jesus said, every person must be, and in order to see the kingdom of heaven. That is what actually regenerates a heart and renews a mind. And when your worldview changes, you start to hate the things that you once loved, love the things that you once hated. In other words, love the things that God loves, and God loves all people who are made in his image. That is so important when we talk about this vital topic. Please go to ratiochristi.org, check out our website, pray for us, support us financially. That will allow this vital work to continue. And remember, when it comes to what we believe and why we believe it, truth matters.